we'll do is I'll have myself and the ranking member do our opening statements. We'll recess for it's one vote at this point for the vote, and then we'll come back and begin our witness statements. So let me start by thanking today's witnesses for testifying about the ongoing crisis in Ethiopia. For decades, Ethiopia has been a key security partner for the U.S. in the Horn of Africa and Red Sea corridor, a region of tremendous strategic significance. New Jersey is also home to a proud Ethiopian diaspora community that remains actively engaged with current events. Until recently, many of us country that appeared to be in the midst of a historic transition to democracy after years of authoritarian rule. Now, a brutal war in Tigray, internationalized by Eritrea's participation, violence, and insecurity in other parts of the country, and rapidly closing political space have given rise to the possibility that Ethiopia is instead on a trajectory towards state collapse. On Tigray, let me be blunt. I see echoes of Darfur. There are reports of extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, forced displacement of Tigrayans. Armed actors have looted and destroyed health and education installations, attacked refugee camps. CNN recently reported that armed actors are blocking food aid. Aid workers have been murdered. As a result, Tigray now appears to be on the brink of famine. All sides are guilty of abuses, but the fragmentary reporting we have indicates that Ethiopian, Eritrean, and allied militia have disproportionately been responsible for targeting civilians in a manner that is both reckless and sinister. We appear to be witnessing war crimes and crimes against humanity. While the conflict in Tigray is the most alarming and graphic illustration of insecurity and ethnic violence in Ethiopia, it is far from the only place in the country where civilians, including members of Ethiopia's two largest ethnic groups, Amhara and Oromo, and other communities are being targeted and killed in significant numbers. A major force behind much of the unrest gripping the country is rapidly closing political space as a result of a failed democratic transition. The Prime Minister initiated laudable reforms early in his tenure. However, momentum has shifted. His government has jailed opposition leaders and their supporters, denied them due process. On his watch, journalists have been intimidated and even killed, and dissent and free speech have been suppressed. Unfortunately, the Ethiopian government has refused to pursue the kind of political dialogue that could lead to a political consensus about how a new Ethiopia should be governed. In this environment, there is little hope that Ethiopia's June 21st elections can credibly reflect the will of the people. I applaud the administration's focus on this crisis. The appointment of Ambassador Feldman as special envoy to the Horn of Africa sent an important signal. Although we do need to have a broader conversation about special envoys in general, I appreciate this effort thus far. But Prime Minister Abe has met our diplomatic initiatives with stonewalling, broken promises, and unfilled commitments. The government has failed to provide unfettered humanitarian access, secure the withdrawal of Eritrean troops, or commit to a political solution to the conflict. And throughout, it has engaged in misrepresentation and disinformation, including on the origins of the crisis in Tigray, the human rights and humanitarian situation on the ground, and the active involvement of foreign troops in the conflict. It has become abundantly clear that events on the ground call for a robust response from the U.S., the region, and the international community, one that conveys an unequivocal message. We will not tolerate war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic violence. We must pursue accountability no matter how high up the chain of command responsibility lies. I support the administration's announcement of visa sanctions and a pause in some assistance. We should also impose targeted financial sanctions on individuals perpetrating conflict, use our voice and vote at international financial institutions to oppose all funding that does not directly support the basic needs of the Ethiopian people, and ensure that Ethiopian troops currently operating in Tigray, who may be implicated in war crimes are not deployed as UN peacekeepers. In addition, the administration should begin marshaling international support for arms embargoes so that the weapons of war fueling this disastrous crisis can be taken off the table. We have strategic interests in partnership with Ethiopia, and its leaders will not be pleased by these actions. But the pursuit of our strategic interests at the expense of the Ethiopian people flies in the face of core American values and is ultimately unsustainable. With that, let me turn to the distinguished ranking member, Senator Risch, for his statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ethiopia is a vital and strategic security, economic, and regional partner whose relationship did improve significantly with the United States under Prime Minister Abiy's government. The historical political transition in 2018 that ushered Abiy into power was initially met with great optimism, not just from the United States, but also the world. The promise for Ethiopia's democratic transition is still possible, but recent events in both Ethiopia and the wider region, as well as global challenges like the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting economic shocks, have complicated Ethiopia's journey. In particular, the ongoing war in Tigray, which began last November, has not just eroded U.S. optimism in Ethiopia's democratic future, but has instilled deep concerns that Ethiopia's economic and political transition is not for every Ethiopian. This war and its aftershocks have exposed deep divisions in Ethiopian society, and worse, has reignited possibilities of our greatest fears for this vital country anchoring the Horn of Africa region. I'm horrified by what we are witnessing in Tigray, a war that was initially termed by the Ethiopian government as a law enforcement operation. This operation has displaced millions and left millions more in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. The war has inflamed intercommunal violence, seen mass killings, widespread use of rape as a weapon, targeted destruction of livelihoods, and other horrifying cases of human rights abuses. It has also caused a large displacement of persons, which has led to a massive refugee flow, primarily into Sudan. This conflict has also impacted peacekeeping missions in Sudan and Somalia, inflamed tensions on Ethiopia's borders, and forced regional states to pick sides, not just regarding the Tigray war, but also the crisis over the filling of Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, also known as GERD. The war in Tigray is a threat to not only the future of the Ethiopian state and the wider region, but also to the strategic, economic, and security interests of the United States. Increased instability on the Horn of Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, further aggravates racked with crisis in countries undergoing fragile transitions. Such instability also undermines vital U.S. counterterrorism efforts. Countries like China, Russia, Turkey, and others in the Gulf are actively scrambling over access to resources and securing influence and power centers on the Horn of Africa and elsewhere on the continent, of course. At the end of the 116th Congress, introduced a resolution with Senator Cardin calling for a peaceful resolution to the Tigray conflict. We reintroduced an updated version of the resolution this Congress, which passed this committee in late March and moved unanimously out of the full Senate just last week. While Ethiopia's transition faces significant challenges, passing this resolution sent an important bipartisan signal to Ethiopia, our allies, and our own government that the withdrawal of Eritrean forces, the cessation of hostilities in Tigray, and getting Ethiopia back on track with its democratic transition are priorities for the United States Senate and the United States government. Every day we learn of new details reflecting the true horror of violence occurring throughout Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government has either dismissed such reports as false or provided assurances to our diplomats and officials that the situation is not as bad as it seems. Sometimes the government will even commit to conducting investigations and holding accountable anyone found to have committed a crime. That is a commitment only. But we have seen this script before in places like Rwanda, Darfur, and Zimbabwe. Leaving matters of accountability up to one of the participants in this conflict will not stop the atrocities and suffering. The United States and its allies must continue to transition and do so quickly from a position of hands-off diplomacy, like encouragement, engagement, and talking to the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments to hands-on action. Even though it took longer than I would have liked, I'm pleased by this administration's recent actions to impose visa sanctions on those carrying out those atrocities and thwarting vital humanitarian assistance. I'm also glad to see limits placed on foreign aid and using our voice and vote at multilateral financial institutions to send a clear message to the Ethiopian government that what is happening in their country is unacceptable. I encourage the administration to continue exploring every option to end the war in Tigray, to continue building a coalition of like-minded allies, to pursue justice and accountability, including global Magnitsky sanctions, and to work with the Ethiopian people to help get their democratic transition back on track, starting with salvaging their upcoming general elections on June 25th. I look forward to a robust discussion on these issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Risch. So there is one vote. The committee will recess to, subject to the call of the chair, and when we return, we'll introduce our two distinguished witnesses and look forward to their testimony. With that, this hearing is subject to recess.
Fellows have done a really good job this year, but I feel like they've done a good job. I wish the circumstances would have been better for them.
It's tricky, and I think one of the things I've learned is that
So this is your last one, and then back to state, and then what's your...
This hearing, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order once again. With us today on behalf of the administration is Ambassador Robert Godek, the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs, who has a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service. Ambassador Godek previously served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau. Prior to these assignments, the ambassador was Deputy Commandant and International Affairs Advisor at the National War College and Ambassador to Kenya. Ambassador Godek also served as the Principal Deputy Coordinator for Counterterrorism in the Bureau of Counterterrorism in the Department of State and our Ambassador to Tunisia. Ambassador Godek is joined this morning by Ms. Sarah Charles, the Assistant to the Administrator of USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Prior to that, Ms. Charles was the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee, where she led efforts to reform the humanitarian aid system and promote policies to improve the lives of refugees and other conflict-affected people. Her previous positions include several stints on the White House National Security Council, including as Director for Humanitarian Affairs, Acting Senior Director for Strategic Planning, and before joining the NSC, Ms. Charles covered the Middle East for USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for the insights. I know you'll provide the committee. Your full statements will be included in the record. We ask you to summarize it in about 5 minutes so we can have a conversation with you. And Ambassador, you will be recognized first. Please proceed.
Mr.
Mr. Chairman, ranking member, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about Ethiopia, a country with a rich history, but that today is racked by intercommunal violence that threatens to undermine its national unity and destabilize the Horn of Africa. The United States is committed to building an enduring partnership with the Ethiopian people, but that only adds to the grave concern that we all share about the crisis in the country, particularly in Tigray. The violence in Tigray is horrifying. It shocks the conscience. Since the conflict began in November, thousands have died, with thousands more injured. We estimate that there are approximately 2 million internally displaced persons, 63,000 refugees, and 5.2 million people in urgent need of assistance. The United States condemns in the strongest terms the brutal killings, sexual violence, including gang rape, forced removals, wanton destruction of civilian property. We condemn all of the human rights violations, abuses, and atrocities that have taken place in Tigray. The atrocities have been committed by all of the armed actors, including the Ethiopian National Defense Force, Amharan Regional Forces, Eritrean Defense Forces, and to some, but a lesser degree, by the Tigray People's Liberation Front. In Western Tigray, security forces belonging to the Amhara regional government are forcing ethnic Tigrayans from their homes in what Secretary Blinken has described as acts of ethnic cleansing. The Eritrean Defense Forces are undertaking a campaign of unremitting violence and destruction that amounts to the collective punishment of the people of Tigray. The violence, abuses, and atrocities are unacceptable. They must stop now. Despite statements by the Ethiopian government that the conflict is over, the security situation has worsened in recent weeks, exacerbating the dire humanitarian crisis and hindering an already difficult response. U.S. and UN analysis shows that the continuing conflict has resulted in a situation close to famine. There are confirmed reports of Tigrayans dying from malnutrition and starvation. Increased fighting, checkpoints, lawlessness, and harassment by the warring parties are blocking humanitarian movements and putting them at physical risk throughout Tigray. The killings of a USAID partner staff member and 7 other humanitarian workers are tragic, and we condemn them. Since the beginning of the conflict, the U.S. government has worked with international partners to end it. We seek an immediate ceasefire, full and unhindered humanitarian access, protection of civilians, the withdrawal of Eritrean forces and Amhara regional forces, a political settlement of the crisis, and an independent international investigation of human rights violations and abuses and atrocities, and accountability for those responsible. The administration is using every available tool to alleviate suffering and end the conflict. We have coordinated with like-minded partners, regional governments, the African Union, and a wide range of other organizations and individuals. We have pressed the UN Security Council and the UN Human Rights Council to put the situation in Ethiopia on their agendas and to act to end the crisis. We've engaged directly with the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments at the highest levels, pressing them to end the hostilities and to follow through on commitments for the withdrawal of Eritrean forces, as well as to protect civilians and ensure unhindered humanitarian access. Multiple calls from the Secretary of State to Prime Minister Abiy and Senator Coons traveled to Ethiopia on behalf of President Biden resulted in some modest progress, but it is far from sufficient. Following his appointment, Special Envoy Feltman took a 2-week trip to the region earlier this month, an intensive effort to find a durable solution. He will return to the region next week. While diplomatic efforts have been underway, the administration has also taken stronger steps. In light of the human rights situation, we have restricted our foreign assistance to Ethiopia. We will continue, however, humanitarian assistance and other critical programs in health, food security, democracy, and human rights. We are withholding support for new lending from the multilateral development banks that does not address basic human needs and are asking our allies to do likewise. Secretary of State has taken steps to impose visa restrictions on Ethiopian and Eritrean government officials, Amhara regional and irregular forces, and members of the TPLF who are impeding the resolution of the crisis, blocking humanitarian access, or committing atrocities. Should those stoking the conflict fail to reverse course, Ethiopia and Eritrea should anticipate further actions. It cannot be business as usual in the face of the violence and atrocities in Tigray. Tragically, while Tigray is the worst of the ethnic conflicts in Ethiopia, it is only one of them. From attacks on ethnic Amharans in the Gumuz and Benishangul Gumuz, ethnic Oromo and Amharans in Oromia, to violence between people in the Afar and Somali regions, to the multiple conflicts unfolding in the southern nations, nationalities, and peoples region, Ethiopia is at a turning point. The government's response of mass arrests, media restrictions, human rights violations, and declining political space is fueling intercommunal rivalry and imperiling the national elections now scheduled for June 21. Widespread insecurity, mass displacement, and logistical challenges raise serious questions about these elections, and the United States has made the decision not to deploy observers to monitor them. We urge the Ethiopian government to begin an inclusive dialogue of reconciliation to end the deep-rooted conflicts and to find a shared democratic path forward. The United States is prepared to support such a dialogue. Finally, there are the ongoing challenges around the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and the Al-Fashaga border area between Sudan and Ethiopia. On the GERD, the United States believes Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan's concerns over water security can best be addressed through serious negotiations among the parties under the leadership of the African Union. Both problems pose risks to the regional peace and security, and the United States government is working hard with partners to help resolve them. As I said at the beginning, the United States is committed to a partnership with the Ethiopian people, the country's national unity, stability in the Horn of Africa. But Mr. Chairman, members, alarm bells are ringing in Ethiopia. The risk of protracted and wider conflict is growing, and the time for action to prevent it is now. In that regard, I want to thank the Congress for the strong resolutions and statements that have been issued. They're important and they help. The State Department will continue to work closely with you to address the crises in Ethiopia. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ms. Charles.
Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Risch, distinguished members of the committee, thank you.
I'm sorry, do you have your microphone on?
Get closer.
Thank you. Is this better? Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Risch, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the crisis in Ethiopia, the life-saving assistance that USAID is providing, and the ongoing challenges that impact our response. I also want to thank the committee for its continuous engagement, not least of which Senator Coons for his recent travel to Ethiopia at the request of President Biden. Many of us first learned the word famine in relation to Ethiopia nearly 40 years ago. I want to be clear, without an immediate cessation of hostilities, improved humanitarian access, and a scale-up of assistance, we could again see widespread famine in Ethiopia this year, the first time since the 1980s. In Tigray, after more than 6 months of hostilities, approximately 5.2 million people are in need of assistance out of a total population of 6 million. Approximately 2 million of them are children. As striking as these numbers are, even more striking are the lived experiences of people in the region. I want to take a moment to share one of their stories. Mariam, a pseudonym for a person receiving assistance from one of our partners in Tigray, lost 25 members of her family, her brother, and recently her 5-month-old baby boy who succumbed to malnutrition. Mariam now suffers from extreme mental distress due to the trauma she's experienced. The grim reality is that there are roughly 2 million other stories of displacement like Mariam's. In Tigray and across the border in Sudan, where 63,000 refugees have fled, the scale of need is staggering, and averting famine will require more than just food assistance. It requires health, nutrition, and water and sanitation services to help malnourished bodies fight off illness. But the ongoing fighting has destroyed critical water and hygiene infrastructure and caused Tigray's health system to collapse. Just 16% of hospitals and health centers are fully functioning. We have also heard devastating reports of abuse by armed actors across Tigray. The reports not only speak to widespread incidents of rape and other gender-based violence, but of systematic attempts to dismantle society and destroy families. Some perpetrators are targeting the wives of priests, abusing women in front of their families, or using a level of violence so brutal that women are left with organ damage. The severity of abuse is among the absolute worst I have seen in my nearly 2 decades of humanitarian work. We at USAID condemn these abuses in the strongest possible terms. In the face of staggering need, the United States has responded with significant support and advocacy. We're the largest donor to the humanitarian response, providing nearly $305 million in humanitarian assistance since the conflict began. USAID is providing enough food to feed 4 million people and treat more than 400,000 women and children suffering from malnutrition for 3 months. Our partners will run nearly 60 mobile health and nutrition units across Tigray and support the operation and rehabilitation of 300 health facilities. To respond to the egregious use of gender-based violence in this conflict, we're providing safe spaces for women and girls, training for social workers, psychosocial support, and case management for survivors. However, our assistance will not be enough to avert famine in Ethiopia if the parties to the conflict continue to obstruct access. Currently, over 1 million people in need are out of reach of humanitarian assistance. The response is plagued by access constraints imposed by the government of Ethiopia, including restrictions on visas and communications equipment for humanitarian staff, both of which are critical for our partners' security and ability to sustain and expand operations. But our biggest challenges are the ongoing hostilities and the continued blocking of access by Eritrean Defense Forces, Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Amharic Regional Forces, and others. Our partners also report increased hostility and targeting of humanitarian workers. By blocking food assistance and preventing farmers from planting and harvesting, these actors are actively exacerbating the risk of famine in Tigray. Lastly, the Tigray response is underfunded, and we continue to urge other donors to scale up their assistance to meet unmet needs. I'm honored to be here today to discuss our work and underscore the United States' commitment to the people of Ethiopia. But while our humanitarian assistance can help alleviate urgent needs, it will not address the root causes of the conflict or ongoing human rights abuses. Despite the heroic efforts of local communities and humanitarian workers, the trajectory of the crisis in Tigray is clear. Widespread famine, unless the parties to the conflict provide unhindered humanitarian access and allow the people of Tigray to once again plant. We owe it to women like Haben, who was a sesame farmer in western Tigray before she was forced to leave her home with her husband and 3 children. She now lives in an overcrowded schoolroom with 24 other women and their families. She told our partners that without assistance, she and her family would have starved. And we owe it to Haben's neighbors, 1 million of whom continue to be out of reach of assistance, to demand better from the parties to the conflict. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll start a round of 5-minute questions. The conflict in Tigray has taken a horrific toll on the population, as we've spoken about and heard here. And the implications for international peace and security are significant. Secretary Blinken at a House Foreign Affairs hearing on March the 10th said there had been, quote, acts of ethnic cleansing in western Tigray. So, Ambassador, are we witnessing war crimes or crimes against humanity in Tigray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States, as I said, is horrified by the reports of brutal killings, the sexual violence, the gang rape, the forced removals, wanton destruction, the acts of ethnic cleansing that Secretary Blinken referred to. We condemn all of these in the strongest possible terms. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has warned that the international community is seeing atrocities that may well amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity. The Patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has termed the conflict a genocide against the Tigrayan people. And the Department of State takes those warnings extremely seriously and is pressing all parties to end the conflict.
So the State Department is not ready to call it.
Mr. Chairman, we are acutely aware of the need to determine whether the conduct meets the legal standards for atrocity crimes.
And we are acutely waiting for that determination, because for many of us, we believe, in fact, these are war crimes and crimes against humanity. So, and I understand the concerns of such a designation, but we cannot turn blindly away when such things happen in the world. And so I look forward for the State Department's determination. I hope they will come to the right one. In addition to visa restrictions and pausing assistance, what other measures is the administration prepared to take to respond to the continuing human rights abuses?
Mr. Chairman, let me just add on the previous question that we do have a fact-based review underway that is being conducted very quickly, and the Secretary of State has the final determination on this. With respect to the other actions that we're prepared to take beyond the visa restrictions, as I noted in my statement, we have suspended much of our assistance, certainly related to economic growth and security assistance. We are looking at a range of other sanctions to include Global Magnitsky Act sanctions, other potential sanctions that would be targeted and directed at individuals or institutions that are supporting the ongoing conflict, impeding resolution, impeding an end to the conflict, or otherwise obstructing humanitarian access or committing human rights abuses and violations. We've made very clear in the Secretary's statement and previously that if we do not see immediate progress on these fronts, that we will be imposing additional sanctions. Ethiopia and Eritrea can expect further action.
Give me a sense, and the committee a sense, of what are the implications for U.S. strategic interests in the Horn of Africa should instability in Ethiopia become more widespread?
Obviously, the risk at this moment is very large. If the conflict in Ethiopia spreads, it will destabilize the entire region. Ethiopia has been a critical anchor in the region. They supply peacekeeping troops to some missions. They're in Somalia. I think if Ethiopia continues down the road that it's going, there's a risk of a massive humanitarian crisis, a refugee crisis, and it poses a risk to the wider region as well. Obviously, the Red Sea area is a critical thoroughfare for commerce, and it is potential for a wide area that would be destabilized and pose a significant risk to the interests of the United States and obviously the people of the region.
Finally, Ms. Charles, your testimony is rather riveting. What is the scope and scale of the sexual and gender-based violence in Tigray? Is the government trying to suppress information about the extent of the use of rape as a weapon of war? And what efforts are we making to respond to the needs of survivors, given the gaps identified by NGOs?
Thank you for that question, Senator Menendez. What we're seeing is widespread and systematic targeting of women using gender-based violence in ways that really are quite horrific. And as I mentioned in my testimony, some of the worst instances of gender-based violence I've seen in my 20 years of humanitarian work. We are providing support services for victims of gender-based violence, including psychosocial care, safe spaces for women and girls, training of social workers. The The UN estimates that 22,000 women could seek treatment for gender-based violence this year in Tigray. We anticipate that that's a significant underestimate of the number of women who have suffered from gender-based violence, not least of which because of the steps that the parties are taking to block access. And we feel like as much as we are supporting protection and support for victims of gender-based violence, the ability of our partners to be present and sustain presence throughout Tigray, not just in urban centers, is necessary to ultimately help provide protection services.
Thank you. Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Godek, I, like lots of people around here, have been visited by all of the parties involved in the GERD and the filling of the dam and the concerns surrounding that. What are your thoughts as to what the current conditions on the ground have done as far as the negotiations to try to come to some resolution of that?
Thank you, Senator. So obviously there is a substantial effort underway to get all of the parties to come to a resolution, to an agreement. We do believe that there are technical solutions to the concerns that the parties have, and that would allow, frankly, a resolution of this problem.
I'm assuming we talk about the different parties involved and haven't mentioned the Egyptians, but I assume if they get offended by this and get somehow engaged, that's going to complicate the situation even worse in the area. Am I right or wrong on that?
I'm sorry, Senator, if they
get involved militarily or whatever, I guess, is that going? I assume that's going to complicate things worse there. Is that right?
Absolutely. Obviously, Senator, that would be catastrophic if there were some sort of military engagement over this. The United States supports an African Union process to resolve this dispute. We support the negotiations which are being undertaken by the African Union. We are prepared to provide significant support. Special Envoy Feltman has already been engaged on this matter. We believe, again, that there are solutions to this problem. And really, in the first instance, what we would be looking for is a sort of a two-stage process. So initially, some sort of agreement around the immediate concern about the filling that would be likely to happen in July, and around which certainly the Egyptians and the Sudanese have a lot of concerns. And then a second stage that really provides a longer-term solution around the water and its use and the dam. So we are working very hard on this, but it does need to be a peaceful resolution.
My sense is in listening to the parties, some are more enthusiastic about the African Union involvement than others, but also some of them seem to be begging for our assistance to get more engaged in this than what we are. Am I correct on that?
Yes, you're correct on that. I think what I would say, Senator, is the challenge is that, again, there are kind of technical solutions to the issues that the parties raise, but there is an absence of political will. These differences can be bridged, but the parties, all of them, have to be prepared to come to the table to reach a reasonable agreement. But there are differences in the view, obviously, between the various parties about our involvement, about the African Union involvement.
You think more involvement on our part would be helpful or not?
I think our involvement is very important, Senator. I think that we can provide both technical expertise, for example, on best ways to operate dams or water use or other things that would be helpful. And so we've sought to do that. Also, we've frankly sought to provide some support to the African Union in its mediation efforts. So I think our involvement is important.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Ms. Charles, the elections that are supposed to take place late in June, we, the United States, has been pressing to see that they are held and held appropriately. Having said that, listening to what I hear about what's going on, particularly in the countryside, do you think that those elections are going to have the kind of credibility that are needed after the fact?
Thank you, Senator Risch. I'll let Ambassador Godek speak to the credibility of the elections.
Senator, we are very seriously concerned about the upcoming elections. There are a number of logistical issues around the conduct of them. Frankly, in many respects, they're not prepared logistically. There are also concerns about the political space, that the various parties, that others in Ethiopia have had to carry out the elections. We have expressed our concerns quite clearly to the government. Many of the specific logistical concerns I'll just mention were quite well documented, I think, in the IRI NDI report that just came out. Our view is that what really is critical here is that there be an inclusive dialogue started in Ethiopia to address the underlying issues. One election is not going to resolve these problems. There are serious doubts about its credibility, and what we need to see is a long-term effort to address the underlying tensions between the communities. And without that, I think the problems will continue and worsen in the country.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Risch. I understand we have Senator Cardin virtually with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank both of our presenters for their incredible service. I know this is extremely difficult, and I know it's very challenging just to be a witness to what's happening in Ethiopia. So, Mr. Ambassador, you talk about the United States expressing its objection in the strongest possible terms to the violence that's taking place. But I think action speaks better than words. And I think Senator Menendez's point about the determination of war crimes or crimes against humanity is a clear position for the United States. So I would just urge the administration as quickly as possible to complete its review. And I hope the outcome is very clear to the international community about the atrocities that are taking place in Ethiopia. I want to drill down on your statement about documenting and holding accountable those that are responsible for these atrocities. Too often, we allow the documentation to be lost, and too often we compromise accountability in the sake of getting parties together to communicate. Obviously, the number one priority is to end the atrocities, to end the violence, and to provide humanitarian assistance to the population. But for this circumstance to not repeat itself as often as we've seen around the world, we do have to have a full documentation, and there needs to be accountability. So what assurances can you give this committee that the United States will use its influence to make sure we have a full accounting, full transparency, and accountability?
Thank you, Senator. I can assure you that the United States government is going to use its voice and the tools that are available to it to hold everyone responsible for atrocities, prolonging the conflict, interfering with humanitarian supplies to account. We have been very clear about that, not just through statements, but now obviously taking steps, for example, the visa restrictions that the Secretary has imposed. It is good, and we welcome the fact that the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, UN, and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission have undertaken a review and are going to prepare a report on the human rights violations that have taken place. Their work has begun. They're on the ground in Ethiopia. That project will take about 3 months. But it is not, it's not going to be ultimately a criminal investigation. It's going to be a documenting of what's happened. It's critically important, and it's a critical first step toward holding people to account for what they have done, holding those who have committed crimes to account. What will be important is another step on transitional justice to really, again, hold those people responsible to account. And that's something we will also commit to working on, and it is important. Ultimately, the only way to stop these things from happening, whether it's in Ethiopia or anywhere in the world, is to hold those responsible accountable. So we're committed to doing that.
Oh, I agree with that statement. It's chilling. I mean, Mr. Charles, your testimony is chilling that we may have, again, a conflict-induced famine in Ethiopia, which people are going to die as a result of the activities of those that are abusing the rights of others. So is there a time schedule in regards to the review on either war crimes or crimes against humanity? That's a term that the international community fully understands and recognizes, and U.S. leadership here is going to be critically important. Do we have a time frame as to when we can expect that review to be completed?
Senator, the review is ongoing even as we sit here today. The final decision on that is the Secretary of State's. I can't give you a specific timeline. I can promise you we'll continue the review and make a decision.
Then we have your commitment that you will keep this committee informed as to that process and the likely time frame in which a decision will be made.
I do commit to that, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Menendez and Ranking Member Risch. And I just want to open by saying how appreciative I am for your personal active engagement, to have a full committee hearing on this topic, to have a clear and forceful public statements and active diplomacy from the administration, and your editorial jointly with the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee was very forceful and very clear about the path forward and challenges Prime Minister Abe and the leadership of Ethiopia to take steps now to change course, and lays out what might happen if that is not the case. Ambassador Godek, great to see you again. I've enjoyed serving with you, knowing you for many years, and greatly appreciated the chance to travel to Ethiopia with you. And Ms. Charles, thank you for your service at USAID and your work to address the humanitarian crisis in Tigray. As has been remarked, I traveled to Ethiopia in March 18th to the 22nd as a personal emissary of our president to speak with Prime Minister Abe and to convey President Biden's grave concerns about the conflict in Tigray and other regional challenges, the GERD, El Fashaga border disputes, and the situation within Ethiopia, violence in other areas, but in particular, the humanitarian crisis in Tigray, the presence of Eritrean troops, the lack of accountability for human rights violations, and the urgent need for a ceasefire. And then 3 weeks ago, I traveled with fellow committee member Chris Van Hollen to Sudan, as well as to the UAE, and had very constructive meetings in Khartoum, but also visited the Kuba refugee camp at the eastern border of Sudan, a refugee camp filled overwhelmingly by Tigrayan refugees, and heard firsthand about the horrors this conflict has inflicted on the Ethiopian people. Now in its 7th month, this conflict is estimated to have killed thousands and left as many as 6 million in desperate need of aid. And as we've heard from the witnesses, rape and other forms of sexual violence are widespread and systematic. And after months of intense diplomatic efforts, I support the Biden administration's decision to apply visa restrictions on all who are fueling the violence in Tigray. So, Ambassador, I want to talk, if I can, with you about the status of Ethiopia's transition. Many of us were very encouraged by Prime Minister Abe's initial rise and initial opening of space for civil society, the release of political prisoners, the allowing of banned political parties to participate. And his rise to power was facilitated by years of widespread protests against government policies and brutal repression. He shared an inspiring vision of Ethiopia that inspired people in his country and around the world. But the protest movement that largely brought him to power was led by young men in Oromia, many of whom are now in prison or who have joined armed groups. How would you assess Prime Minister Abe's vision of the transition compared with its current reality on the ground?
Thank you, Senator, and it's a pleasure to see you again as well. We certainly share the view that when Prime Minister Abe came to power, he presented a vision that was attractive and hopeful, of opening up the country, of expanding democracy, of giving people more rights. Unfortunately, the implementation of that has not met, I think, all of the hopes. We're deeply concerned about the closing of the political space, the reality that many politicians have been arrested, some are in prison, that there have been, there was some opening of the media, that there continues to be significant issues with reporters being jailed, international reporters such as Simon Marks being expelled from the country. There are significant issues in the implementation of this vision, which is why we believe at this point the only path forward is an inclusive dialogue that involves all the parties. This election, which is sure to take place, is one thing, but we need the dialogue to make progress.
Two more questions, if I might, given my limited time. Ms. Charles, in your assessment, is the humanitarian situation in Tigray getting better or worse? And are Ethiopian authorities becoming better or worse partners in addressing the ongoing humanitarian crisis?
First of all, thank you for your continued engagement on this and your travel in March. I think after your visit and high-level engagement from others in the administration, we did see some progress, including the lifting of regulations that required our partners to get permission to travel in Tigray. But we continue to see access restrictions from the government, critically around visas and importation of communication equipment that is necessary for our partners to scale and maintain operations in a very insecure environment.
Thank you. Last question. Ambassador Godek, in March, I met a prime minister who was charismatic and compelling, who had a forceful vision, and who reassured me, made a commitment to me and to our president that Eritrean troops would leave Ethiopia and Tigray. And in fact, he promptly flew to Asmara, met with Isaias, and said that he had demanded that Eritrean troops leave. It is now nearly June, and there's been no progress I'm aware of towards meeting that commitment. And reports just broke this week that jointly Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers have forcibly rounded up and detained more than 500 young men and women from IDP camps in the area of Shire. What's your assessment of how closely Ethiopian and Eritrean security forces are coordinating? And what accountability would you expect if those detained folks are harmed and not released?
Our assessment, Senator, is that the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces are cooperating very closely up in Tigray, and it is obviously a source of serious concern. This latest report that people were detained, IDPs were detained, is extremely grave. We have already raised this with the Ethiopian government. The UN has raised it with them. Obviously, if these folks are harmed, if these individuals are harmed, it's unacceptable. It's absolutely unacceptable. We will continue to be very forceful on this point.
Mr. Chairman, your editorial lays out a clear series of next steps that might well be taken if this situation continues to deteriorate. It is my real hope that Prime Minister Abe will yet hear the offers of the world community in the United States to work together to declare a ceasefire, to resolve the humanitarian crisis, to deliver accountability for crimes against humanity that have been committed by a range of parties, and step back from a conflict that I think threatens the entire future of Ethiopia. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and thank you for your good work in this regard. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of you for your work and appearing before the committee today. Ambassador, let me thank you for raising in response to Senator Kuhn's general question, the specific issue related to press freedom. Senators Cardin and Leahy and myself have raised this in several different ways. And of course, we all around the world stand for the idea that no government should curtail the right of the press to be able to tell objective stories about what's happening on the ground, but in particular in Ethiopia and Tigray, we depend on the ability of journalists to be able to translate to the world what is happening and to be able to inform us as to the extent of the atrocities. Appreciate you continuing to focus on that question. I wanted to drill down, Ms. Charles, on one specific issue, and I don't know if it's been raised, forgive me if it has been, on the humanitarian front, and that is the Ethiopian government's refusal to provide visas to international humanitarian staff and parties that are trying to get into Tigray. Just wanted to get an update as to whether we foresee any progress in getting more aid workers into Tigray, and what are the roadblocks that are standing in the way of these requests?
Thank you for that question. We continue to ask for extended visas for humanitarian workers, 6-month visas, as well as allow for the importation of critical communications equipment. Both of these items are very important when operating in such a difficult and complex environment as we see in Tigray, and we have not yet seen any progress from the government of Ethiopia on either of those requests, in spite of it being raised at the highest levels and consistently over the last several months.
What's the being able to get a greater flow of willing humanitarian organizations? I mean, what a triumph that there are organizations that are willing to go into these areas and help people despite the risks. What are the consequences of these visas not being granted?
Well, the consequence of continued obstruction by all parties, including the government of Ethiopia, is that we will be facing the first widespread famine in Ethiopia since the 1980s. We need the government of Ethiopia to cooperate with our humanitarian partners to allow for the scale-up of assistance that's necessary to avert the worst.
Mr. Gode, I just was hoping that you might talk to us a little bit about the influence of Gulf nations, the UAE and the Saudis. Obviously, the UAE has been an important player, probably highlighted by the 2018 normalization agreements. Some talk has recently been centered around their withdrawal militarily from some of their basing operations. I would just note that open source reporting suggests the UAE is at the same time building up a fairly substantial capacity on an island off of Yemen, purpose to be determined. What can you say about, in particular, the UAE, but more broadly, the Gulf's influence, their ability to be a partner or a obstruction to the path to peace that we're seeking?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Since the early days of the conflict in Tigray, we've been speaking with both the UAE and Saudi Arabia officials about the crisis, about the conflict. We have asked them to intervene. Both countries have both personal connections and commercial connections, and they do have influence, particularly the Emirates. And they have expressed to us their concern as well about what's happening in Ethiopia and in Tigray. We understand they have raised these concerns. We have a continuing discussion with them and are hopeful that they will continue to press our concerns forcefully. I would note that Special Envoy Feltman, when he travels next week, will be one of his stops. One place he will be going is the Gulf, so he will be stopping in the Emirates, Saudi, for conversations.
Yeah, I note it was not likely coincidental that Senator Coons made a stop in the UAE recently. Listen, I think we have plenty of equities at play with the UAE right now. Their security, our security partnership with them is important to us, but it's more important to them. And to the extent that they continue to have leverage, this is a moment that we should press them on this case. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member Risch, and thank you to our witnesses for your service in a very difficult circumstance. It's depressing to contemplate the atrocities in Tigray, the upcoming election, which is of questionable legitimacy and could lead to more strife and violence. The dispute between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt over the dam project. That in and of itself, that could also lead to military action in an extreme situation. Ms. Charles, tell us about the USAID partner worker who was killed.
First of all, I thank you for raising that. I want to send my condolences out to his colleagues, to his family. This was the first time that we've lost a partner in Tigray where it was clear that they had identified themselves as a humanitarian worker, and we believe that they were targeted as such. And it marks really a quite concerning and tragic turn in the crisis.
You know, sometimes, despite the best intention and the best effort, we can't find the path forward to fixing situations that are so deep-rooted in cultures that are not our own. But even when we can't make headway, sometimes in solving these seemingly intractable problems, we do stand for American values by delivering humanitarian aid. And so the targeting of a humanitarian worker, it's the one thing that we can do that shows that we care and we're there and we're consistent, even if other efforts aren't bearing fruit. But that means the protection of humanitarian aid workers becomes paramount. What, in your experience at in your previous experience, but now at USAID, what can we do to provide better protection for our humanitarian workers in Tigray, but using it as an example of in other dangerous situations as well?
We've certainly worked to scale up the security focal points that we have on our disaster assistance response team, also back here in Washington, that are working very closely with our partners on their security planning. But I want to be very clear, it is the parties to this conflict that are making our partners less safe. It is their decisions to block and obstruct and harass humanitarian workers, and it's one of the reasons why we continue to press on the government of Ethiopia, both to send the message to their troops about the importance of humanitarian access, but also to allow for the importation of communication equipment, allow us to bring in the right kind of staff and coordination structures to provide the kind of security that our partners need.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kaine. I want to tell Ms. Charles that I expressed the sympathies of the committee to our USAID Administrator, Ambassador Powers, on behalf of all. I think following up on Senator Kaine's questioning, the death of anyone is something that we are concerned greatly about. The death of an aid worker, an American aid worker, from my perspective, is a high crime. And at the end of the day, it will only make it more difficult for us to do what is necessary to try to help Ethiopia out of the path that it's in. In that regard, let me ask you, how should the fact that the government of Ethiopia is a party to the conflict change how the international community engages with it relative to both protection needs and the delivery of aid in Tigray?
Thank you again for that, Senator Menendez. I do want to just quickly clarify, while it makes the death no less tragic, it was a local Ethiopian staff member, not an American aid worker that was killed, but no
equally as tragic.
No less tragic. And we certainly are working again with our UN partners, with our NGO partners to develop independent programs driven by humanitarian need, and really demanding from the government of Ethiopia and all parties to the conflict that they allow for that unhindered humanitarian access.
So how do we, so we are actively engaged in urging the Ethiopian government to do this, but if the Ethiopian government continues to be part of the challenge in the delivery of aid, is there any ways in how we deliver that aid to circumvent them, or is that impossible?
We certainly are pursuing any number of methods to deliver assistance. We don't deliver assistance in Tigray through or with the government of Ethiopia. We deliver it independently. But of course, the government of Ethiopia has a lot of control in Tigray over our ability to move freely, our ability to bring the right staff and equipment in, and we continue to press for them to do that unhindered.
Ambassador Godek, Tigray is rightly the focus of a lot of our attention at the moment. But I'm also worried about violence and atrocities in other regions of Ethiopia. Civilians from communities, but not limited to Ethiopia's two largest, the Amhara and Oromo, have been the target of violent attacks in recent months and years. What accounts for this specific violence?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, there is intercommunal, interethnic violence in many areas across Ethiopia. There's a number of drivers of this conflict. Some of them are boundary disputes. Some of it's related to conflict over pastoral lands, areas. There's a number of drivers to this. We do have a number of programs run mostly through USAID and OTI to help address some of the conflicts that are out there. Frankly, the lifting of, in the recent years of some of the restrictions that were in place have had the perverse effect of allowing some of this to boil up. And what's critical is that the government itself take steps again to address the conflicts between these communities. We can, through our programs, help but a broader effort does need to be really initiated, and it needs to be real, and it needs to be serious if these conflicts are going to be brought to an end, to address these longstanding disputes.
I understand Senator Booker is with us virtually.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Please proceed.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful for this hearing and for the time the State Department has spent with me on Horn of Africa issues. If I could just jump right in, it's been really horrific, the reports that I've been reading and hearing about violence and sexual violence against women and girls as young as 8 years old. It has been gruesome to hear, and frankly, it's coming from a number of different forces, not just the Eritreans, these are accusations at least, but the NDF as well as Amara. And I just want to know from both of you, if I can, what are your thoughts about our ability to deal with this, the trauma and violence and the survivors of this trauma and violence? Obviously, we're talked a lot in this hearing about food aid and other humanitarian aid, but this is the scale of the accusations makes me believe that our government and aid agencies should be thinking about that as well.
Thank you for that question, Senator Booker. It is a top priority of our humanitarian response to respond to what you rightly characterized as just horrific incidents of gender-based violence as part of this conflict. So we're working with partners to train social workers, provide safe spaces for women and girls, psychosocial support, and counseling for survivors of gender-based violence.
Ambassador, would you please give me some input as well?
Senator, let me just say that certainly from my perspective as well, these reports are horrifying. The administration does raise the reports of gender-based violence, rape, gang rape, regularly and at top levels with the government. I would note that Ambassador Passi was recently in an IDP camp in Tigray and personally spoke with some of the victims of this violence. She took their graphic and horrible stories back to the Prime Minister and other officials in the government just to stress the importance of addressing this really terrible situation. So it is something we are very much focused on and working to hopefully stop.
And Ambassador, if I could stay with you for a second, I know one of my previous colleagues asked a bit about the influence of the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia in the region. And I'm wondering if you could just take a couple steps with more detail for me about, in general, our efforts and theirs in conflict, or are they? Do you see them as a force that's of making a greater positive influence or making the situation more difficult? Obviously, these are some of our allies. And I'm just curious your overall take on coordination and influence in the region.
Thank you, Senator. I do think that they have significant influence in the region, given their, again, personal connections, the commercial connections that they've got, the investments that have been made. Certainly, the Emiratis have been involved in negotiations, for example, previously, to some degree successfully. They've also sought to engage on the Al-Fashaga border dispute, although in the last few days they have indicated they're pulling back from that. So they have played an important role. What's critical, I think, is that they use all of the influence that they've got in order to help to bring the Tigray conflict to an end and hopefully also to address the other challenges that Ethiopia faces. That they're clear in their communications with Prime Minister Abiy and other officials in the government about the concerns that we have. And I just assure you that we are talking with them in detail constantly at this point about doing that.
And Ambassador, just if I can keep your mic on for a little bit longer, just to ask you, we're heading into this period where it seems to me, unless you give me more information, that the June 21st elections in Ethiopia are going to go forward, even though there's incredibly a lot of concerns with the ability for those elections to be done. And I know in the Tigray region that's not going to happen. And I guess I'm wondering, besides just calling for free and fair elections, is there anything that we can do in this run-up, 3 or 4 week run-up, to better ensure that there would be credible elections taking place? And just can you give me some of your general assessments of your concerns that you might have about the elections as well?
Thank you for the question, Senator. We do have many concerns about the elections. They're going to take place in an environment where there have been significant political limitations. Also, there are big logistical challenges around the elections. As I mentioned earlier, the IRI-NDI report lays those out. I think we have been clear in our communications with the government, the National Election Board, about those concerns. There are specific steps that could be taken in a logistical sense that might help in the next 4 weeks, but I think it's going to be very difficult to really get all the way that the country needs to get to hold fully free, fair, and credible elections. That said, again, we withholding judgment, and we'll continue to urge progress on those challenges that are out there before the elections. And let me just emphasize again, what's really critical here is that there be an inclusive dialogue ultimately. One election is not going to solve the problems of Ethiopia. If there's not a understanding reached among the various communities about the way forward, it's a democratic way forward, there's going to be real trouble in our view.
I want to say thank you. My time's expired. Just 2 points I want to make. Number one, I just appreciate the State Department's willingness to meet with me and brief me independently on these issues. We are in the midst of, there's just a lot of strike points in this area that concern me. I know the ranking member already asked about the dam, the GERD Dam, and clearly all the way to what's going on in Tigray. But I think the most stunning thing that was said during this hearing is the prospects for the first time since, I guess, the 80s, to have us have widespread famine, should we not be able to give humanitarian aid into the region. We are really teetering on the urge of just catastrophic humanitarian crisis in a region from Sudan, South Sudan to Ethiopia, to Eritrea. We're just in Somalia. This is a lot of challenges in this area. So I'm just hope that I know that with Senator Menendez, we will continue to focus on this area. And I'm just really hopeful that I can continue the dialogue with the State Department to see ways that this committee could be doing more to keep focus on that area of the world and see some way out of what could be a true nightmare for all of humanity.
Senator, we certainly agree that Ethiopia is teetering on the brink at the moment, that alarm bells are going off, and that we need all hands on deck to address the challenges. On behalf of the State Department, I am certainly happy, I might know my colleagues are, to remain closely engaged with you personally, Senator, any member of this committee, either, again, individually or the committee as a whole. You have a critical role to play, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Senator Booker. My understanding is I have no colleagues on either side who are with us virtually. Is that correct? Since I'm not hearing anybody, I assume so. I just have then 2 final questions. Ambassador, do we have a regional strategy for the Horn of Africa that no longer hinges necessarily on a close partnership with the Ethiopian government, even as we continue to support the Ethiopian people?
Senator, the Horn of Africa is clearly an increasingly significant region, and its stability and security really critical, obviously, to the people who live there, but there are implications throughout the Red Sea region. There are implications even up to the Mediterranean and across the Indo-Pacific area. Ethiopia has long been kind of a linchpin, a central with its 110 million people, and it's been an important partner. It's at the heart of the region. Its stability is essential to peace and security, which is obviously one of the reasons why we're so focused on trying to address the challenges there. Now, the administration obviously has been hard at work trying to address the challenges in Ethiopia, but also looking at the entire region and how progress can be made, what the linkages are between the various conflicts, what the issues are across boundaries. We're still early in the administration, but I want to assure you that there is a robust conversation going on about how to bring all of this together in a way that makes sense.
Well, I appreciate that. Here's our problem, and it's not only unique to the Horn of Africa. Very often we pursue our strategic and national interests vis-a-vis a country, and that country doesn't pan out to be what we aspire and expect it to be. And if we wait until it's no longer the country we hope it to be, then we're in a world of hurt. So while I'm not for abandoning our aspirations for Ethiopia, I am for being strategic and planning to think about what will happen if that falls apart for a short or longer period of time. And I think we have enough challenges in that regard. I commend that to your attention. When I speak to the Secretary, I will do the same. Now, Ethiopian contributions to UN and AU peacekeeping, they're important, but we need to ensure that those who are implicated in atrocities are not rotated into peacekeeping missions. How do we intend to address that issue?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. We're in full agreement that it's very important that Ethiopian troops who are implicated in atrocities not be participating in peacekeeping operations. We are actively looking at that issue, and we're working to address it. It is a serious concern, and we're on it.
Well, part of the process of being able to address it is to identify those who have been involved in such atrocities and to name them so that we don't have their atrocities extend beyond Ethiopia and other parts of the world. And I think that's critically important. And then finally, I will make a comment. It's not a question. I've spoken to the Egyptians on more than one occasion on this issue at their behest. I have a real sense that if the GERD issue is not dealt with in a way that assures them of their concerns about the Nile flowing into what would be the heart of their water supply in Egypt, that they will do what is necessary. I don't like red lines, but they have suggested that they have red lines. And I take them at their word that they have red lines. Not that they are desirous of doing that. They also have very strong expression that they hope to have a resolution peacefully, but that they have their own red lines. I hope that we are engaging in that very robustly, because the last thing we need, in addition to everything that is going on in Ethiopia, in addition to the possibility of a famine, to the sexual violence that is taking place, is to then have a military conflict over the GERD. So I just seriously hope we are fully engage in where the parties are and how serious some of them are of purpose.
Senator, I can assure you that the administration up to the president are engaged on this matter, very concerned about it, and doing everything we can to resolve it. We certainly agree that any sort of conflict over the GERD or Al-Fashaga would be catastrophic for the region, and it must be avoided. We're working hard to prevent any such conflict.
All right. Well, this hearing record will stay open till the close of business tomorrow. With the thanks of the committee for your testimony and your service, this hearing is adjourned.